Epstein case is one of the most disturbing stories of modern power, not just because of what happened, but because of what never happened afterward. Most people assume that when someone is arrested for trafficking crimes, the investigation leads somewhere clear. Names come out, networks collapse, the truth is exposed, justice feels complete. But with Epstein, the opposite happened. The world watched him get arrested. The headlines were everywhere. Court documents confirmed years of abuse. Victims came forward. And eventually, Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted for helping facilitate trafficking-related crimes connected to Epstein. So the question becomes almost unavoidable. How does someone get put in prison for trafficking, and yet the public still doesn't see the clients? Joe Rogan asked it bluntly, the way millions of people have thought about it privately. How do you lock someone up but never name who it was all for? That gap is what makes the Epstein story feel unfinished, because Epstein wasn't operating in isolation. Long before flight logs became public and contact books leaked into the spotlight, Epstein was already moving comfortably through circles filled with billionaires, politicians, scientists, celebrities, and royalty. He wasn't hiding, he was hosting. Invitations to his private island weren't treated like warnings, they were treated like exclusive opportunities, like access to a world most people could never enter. And what makes it even darker is that this didn't stop after his first conviction. Public reporting has shown that even after Epstein's 2008 arrest, even after he served time, powerful institutions and influential individuals continued interacting with him. Donations were accepted, meetings still happened. His name was still quietly circulating in elite spaces. The narrator explains that this is where the discomfort deepens. Because if someone has already been convicted, why were they still being welcomed? Why was Epstein still able to operate socially, financially, and politically? The video emphasizes that simply appearing in someone's contact list or flight log does not automatically prove wrongdoing. Legal experts repeat that constantly. Association is not the same thing as guilt. But the scale of Epstein's network is what keeps the questions alive. Hundreds of names, years of connections, private jets traveling constantly, and yet only fragments of the full story have ever been made public. That's why so many people feel like the Epstein case became symbolic of something bigger than one criminal. It became symbolic of what happens when wealth and influence surround wrongdoing. Because for ordinary people, investigations are direct, consequences are visible. But here, documents are sealed, names were redacted, evidence was discussed but rarely fully explained. And that leads to the kind of frustration Rogan voiced openly. He pointed out how stunning it is that authorities reportedly seized mountains of material, records, tapes, devices, and yet the public still feels like it's looking at shadows instead of answers. Where did the evidence go? Who reviewed it? What was kept hidden and why? The narrator closes this opening segment with the core tension. Epstein was shocking, yes, but what truly unsettled the world was the sense that Epstein may not have been the full story, that he was surrounded by powerful people for years, and that even now the silence around that network remains louder than any headline. And then comes the twist that pulls Joe Rogan directly into the narrative. Because years after Epstein's conviction, Epstein allegedly tried to meet Rogan himself, and what happened next makes this story even harder to ignore. Because Rogan didn't just talk about Epstein, he almost crossed paths with him. By the time Jeffrey Epstein allegedly tried to meet Joe Rogan, his name was already stained. This wasn't the early days when Epstein was still just a mysterious billionaire moving quietly through elite circles. This was 2017, nearly a decade after Epstein's first conviction. The narrator explains that this detail is what makes the story so unsettling, because most people assume that once someone has been exposed, once they've been arrested, once the world knows, their influence collapses. But Epstein's didn't. According to emails that later surfaced through document releases, Epstein had apparently taken interest in Rogan after seeing him on the podcast. In one message, Epstein reportedly told physicist Lawrence Krauss that Rogan seemed funny and that he would like an introduction. Krauss, who had appeared as a guest on Rogan's show, reached out. The invitation was casual, almost normal on the surface. A dinner, a meeting, even the suggestion that filmmaker Woody Allen could be included. But Rogan's reaction was immediate. He didn't hesitate. He later described it as almost absurd that anyone would think he'd want to meet Epstein. Rogan said he simply Googled him, and once he did, the answer was obvious. No chance. He recalled thinking, "What are you talking about? Are you out of your mind?" The narrator emphasizes how striking this moment is, because it shows something important. Epstein was still trying, still reaching outward, still attempting to connect himself to public figures, entertainers, intellectuals, even after everything. And Rogan wasn't the only one. The video highlights how Epstein's strategy wasn't always about secrecy. It was about proximity, about building rooms where respected people gathered so that being there felt safe. Rogan himself explained it in a way that made the entire system feel darker. He said some people become intoxicated by being around wealth and power, not because they want to be billionaires, but because they want to feel close to them. They want to be in the circle. And Epstein understood that. He allegedly surrounded himself with professors, Nobel-level thinkers, celebrities, comedians, people whose presence made others assume nothing could be wrong. Rogan pointed out how easy it would be for someone to rationalize it. If that genius is there, if that famous person is there, if those respected names are in the room, how bad could it really be? That's what made Epstein's operations so effective. It wasn't just money, it was social camouflage. Rogan even joked about it in his own blunt way, saying Epstein was basically nerd fishing, casting a net for intellectuals, offering access, luxury, attention, and catching people who wanted to believe it was harmless. But Rogan didn't bite. And in hindsight, he sounds almost relieved. He said he never would have gone anyway, not even as a possibility. The narrator notes that Rogan's refusal is now being framed as a kind of warning sign, because Epstein didn't only target politicians or royalty. He targeted anyone with influence, anyone with a platform, anyone who could be pulled into his orbit. And that leads to an even more disturbing realization. If Epstein was still making invitations in 2017, if he was still networking years after his conviction, then how many others didn't walk away? How many people stayed connected? How many meetings still happened quietly behind closed doors? The video makes it clear that this is where the story stops being about one man's crimes and starts becoming about the world that continued to tolerate him. Because Epstein wasn't operating like a disgraced outcast, he was still moving through elite spaces like nothing had changed. And that raises the next major question. What kind of system allows someone like that to keep access, even after everyone knows? Because the deeper you look, the stranger it becomes that Epstein's network didn't shrink, it expanded, and the next part of the story reveals just how far that post-conviction circle really went. What makes the Epstein story especially unsettling isn't just what happened before his first conviction, it's what happened after. By 2008, Epstein was no longer a mystery figure quietly operating in elite circles. He had faced serious legal consequences. His name had already been linked to disturbing allegations. The world knew enough to question him. And yet, his access didn't disappear. In fact, in some ways, it seemed to continue almost uninterrupted. The narrator explains that public records and investigative reporting later revealed that Epstein remained in contact with powerful individuals across finance, academia, and politics even after serving time. Meetings still occurred, emails were exchanged, invitations were extended. One of the most widely discussed examples involved MIT. Reports showed that donations linked to Epstein were accepted by the institution after his conviction. Internal communications later surfaced, suggesting that some officials preferred that Epstein's name not appear publicly in connection with certain contributions. According to reporting, some staff even referred to him as Voldemort, the name that could not be spoken. The nickname sounds almost surreal. A convicted individual whose money was quietly accepted, but whose name was treated like something forbidden. The narrator emphasizes how symbolic that moment became. It wasn't just about a donation, it was about image management. It suggested awareness, an understanding that public association would look bad, yet continued engagement anyway. Joe Rogan reacted strongly to this detail. He pointed out how revealing it was that respected institutions were still taking money from someone with Epstein's history. If everyone knew, why wasn't the door fully closed? And it wasn't just academia. Over the years, media reports confirmed meetings between Epstein and major business leaders. Figures like Bill Gates later acknowledged meeting with him during that period, stating it was related to philanthropic discussions and that the meetings were a mistake in hindsight. The narrator makes a critical clarification. Meeting someone does not automatically imply criminal involvement. That distinction matters. But the volume of continued contact is what fuels suspicion. Because for many watching from the outside, it raises a troubling question. If someone had already been convicted, why risk even being in the same room? Why allow any connection at all? Rogan speculated that part of the answer lies in human psychology. Some people are drawn to proximity with power, even if they don't need anything, even if there's no direct benefit. There's something intoxicating about being inside a room filled with influential people, and Epstein curated those rooms carefully. He reportedly hosted gatherings where respected intellectuals, celebrities, and executives could mingle. The environment itself became a form of credibility. If so many accomplished people were there, the assumption was that it must be legitimate. That's what made Epstein's social network so effective. It wasn't built on secrecy alone, it was built on normalization. The narrator explains that this normalization is what still disturbs observers today, because Epstein's presence in elite spaces didn't feel hidden, it felt tolerated. And that tolerance is what transforms this story from individual criminal behavior into something systemic. Because when someone with a known past continues to be welcomed, it forces the public to question not just the individual, but the institutions surrounding him. Rogan described the situation as toxic, something that could mess with your head if you spent too much time digging into it. The contradictions pile up quickly. A convicted offender still networking, respected institutions quietly managing optics, individuals later distancing themselves once scrutiny intensified. It creates the impression that Epstein's conviction didn't isolate him, it only changed the way people spoke about him. And that's where the story takes another turn, because while social connections continued quietly, physical records of Epstein's network would soon explode into public debate. Flight logs, contact books, passenger manifests, documents that would shift the entire conversation, because once those records surfaced, the world started asking who exactly had been traveling alongside him, and the answers, or lack of them, would only deepen the mystery.
As the Epstein story continued unraveling, one object became almost legendary in the public imagination: the so-called Black Book, a contact directory purportedly linked to Jeffrey Epstein, filled with names, phone numbers, and addresses of high-profile individuals. To many people, it represented something explosive, not necessarily proof of crimes, but proof of proximity, proof of how deeply Epstein's world overlapped with powerful circles. The narrator explains that long before flight logs were debated across the internet, the Black Book became one of the earliest symbols of Epstein's reach. Rumors spread quickly. People claimed it contained the names of elites. Some speculated it contained the names of victims. Others believed it was the key to understanding how Epstein operated for so long without being fully stopped. But what was actually confirmed publicly is more specific. Court filings later revealed that in 2009, federal authorities conducted an operation involving Epstein's former Palm Beach house manager, Alfredo Rodriguez. Rodriguez had reportedly kept a copy of the contact book instead of turning it over when demanded, and according to court documents, he attempted to sell it. The narrator describes how surreal that moment is: a former employee allegedly trying to profit off one of the most notorious address books in modern scandal history. In the released video footage, Rodriguez appears to believe he is selling the material to someone representing a lawyer connected to Epstein's victims. He tells the undercover agent that the book contains contacts of important people, and he makes claims about what it reveals. The narrator stresses an important point. Rodriguez's statements were claims, not verified evidence of everything he suggested, but the fact that the FBI treated the situation seriously enough to conduct a sting operation shows how sensitive the material was considered. Rodriguez was later arrested for attempting to exchange the book for money. And in the video, he also implicates Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein's close associate, who was later convicted on federal trafficking-related charges. Rodriguez describes Maxwell as powerful, claiming she was deeply involved in Epstein's world. He even alleges that she maintained some kind of database of girls. But the narrator is careful here. Rodriguez provided no proof supporting the existence of such a database. Still, his comments added fuel to the growing public perception that Epstein's operation involved more organization than many initially understood, and Maxwell's later conviction only intensified those questions. Because Maxwell was not sentenced for vague association, she was convicted for her role in facilitating trafficking crimes connected to Epstein, which brings the public right back to the same haunting gap. If facilitation occurred, then who was being facilitated? The narrator explains that this is why the Black Book obsession never really faded. It wasn't just celebrity curiosity. It was the sense that Epstein's contact network represented an unfinished map, a list of doors that were never fully opened. And as more documents surfaced over the years, the debate only grew louder. Some people argued that the book was being overinterpreted, that having a phone number in a directory means nothing on its own. Others believed it was one of many pieces pointing toward a larger protected circle. The truth, as legal experts repeatedly state, is complicated. A name in an address book does not equal a crime. A contact does not equal guilt. But in a case already defined by secrecy, the existence of such a directory became symbolic. It represented unanswered questions more than answered ones. And the narrator notes that the sting footage ends abruptly. Rodriguez is handed money, the agent says he will call the lawyer, and then the tape cuts, leaving viewers with the same feeling that defines so much of this case: fragments, loose ends, pieces of something that still doesn't feel fully resolved. But the Black Book was only one part of Epstein's recorded world, because there was another set of documents that would become even more controversial. Records that showed not just who knew Epstein, but who traveled with him. Because once the flight logs became public, the conversation shifted from contacts to passengers, and that's where the scrutiny reached an entirely new level. The Black Book represented Epstein's connections on paper. The flight logs made those connections feel real, physical, documented. Because once investigators and journalists began focusing on Epstein's private jet, the story shifted into an entirely different level of scrutiny. The aircraft, often referred to in media as the Lolita Express, became one of the most infamous symbols of Epstein's lifestyle. It wasn't just a jet, it was a moving extension of his world. Court proceedings and document releases later revealed passenger manifests listing numerous individuals who traveled with Epstein over the years, moving between his properties and international destinations. And when those records became public, the reaction was immediate: outrage, speculation, and a wave of questions that still hasn't fully disappeared. The narrator explains why the flight logs hit differently than rumors or social associations. A contact in a phone book is abstract, but a name on a passenger list suggests proximity, time spent together, shared travel, and in a case already surrounded by secrecy, that felt explosive. High-profile political figures, business leaders, celebrities, names that people never expected to see connected in any way to Epstein's orbit, suddenly became part of the public conversation. The narrator makes an essential clarification. Legal experts stress that appearing in flight logs does not establish criminal wrongdoing. Passenger manifests reflect travel and social association, not proof of crimes. That distinction matters, because the internet often treats these records like automatic guilt. But the law does not work that way. Still, the sheer number of prominent names fueled a broader public frustration. People began asking the same question in a new form. How did Epstein have access to so many powerful individuals? And how did so many people end up on that jet without raising alarms? Some accusers testified that inappropriate conduct occurred during trips, and those allegations were examined as part of federal investigations. Pilots and crew members were questioned. Authorities reviewed passenger records. But despite all of that, the case remained filled with gaps. The narrator explains that the flight logs became less about proving individual crimes and more about exposing how wide Epstein's social reach truly was. Because whether or not passengers were aware of wrongdoing, the manifests showed something undeniable. Epstein was not isolated. He was embedded, and the debate became even more intense as certain names were highlighted in media coverage. One correspondence referenced political figures appearing on multiple flights during the 1990s. Other entries included partially redacted names, fueling even more speculation, and that redaction itself became part of the controversy. Because for many people watching, the question wasn't only who appeared in the logs, it was who didn't, who was being hidden, why were some names blacked out, why did the public keep seeing incomplete fragments instead of full transparency? The narrator notes that officials and legal experts argue redactions can happen for multiple reasons: privacy protections, ongoing investigations, defamation concerns. The fact that someone's name appears in a document does not mean they were charged, accused, or guilty. But public trust is fragile, and in a case like this, every sealed page feels suspicious. Social media reactions exploded, with many accusing authorities of shielding elites rather than prioritizing victims. Others argued the opposite, that reckless speculation harms innocent people. And that tension is exactly what keeps the Epstein case burning in public consciousness. It sits at the crossroads of verified crime and unanswered suspicion, documented evidence and missing clarity. And that's why Joe Rogan's commentary resonates with so many. He questioned why, despite years of investigations, so few high-profile associates have faced charges. He argued that if substantial evidence existed against specific individuals, prosecutions could theoretically move forward. But again, legal standards are strict, and association alone isn't enough. The narrator closes this segment by emphasizing what the flight logs truly represent. Not a final answer, but another layer of the same unresolved mystery. A record showing how Epstein moved through the world and how many powerful people were somewhere nearby. And once you see that scale, the next question becomes almost inevitable. Was Epstein simply a wealthy criminal, or was something deeper protecting him? Because when a man's money, access, and influence remain unexplained, speculation rushes in to fill the silence. And that leads directly into the most controversial theory of all. At a certain point in the Epstein story, the questions stop being only about names and connections and start becoming about something even harder to explain: the money. Because one of the most persistent mysteries surrounding Jeffrey Epstein has always been the same: where did his wealth actually come from? Epstein lived like someone with unlimited resources: private jets, multiple luxury estates, international properties, access to the most exclusive circles on Earth. And yet, for years, no clear explanation ever fully matched the scale of his lifestyle. The narrator explains that this is where speculation begins to thrive. Because when the public is shown fragments, but not full clarity, people naturally fill in the gaps with theories. Joe Rogan touched on this directly. He acknowledged that he didn't know the truth, but he understood why people kept asking the same unsettling question: was Epstein operating alone, or was he being supported? Some commentators have speculated that Epstein could have been connected to intelligence networks, functioning as an asset. Rogan discussed the idea cautiously, framing it as guesswork rather than confirmed fact. He pointed out that many people online want to assign Epstein to one agency or another, but the reality is that no publicly verified evidence has proven Epstein worked on behalf of any government intelligence service. Those claims remain unproven. Still, the reason the theory persists is simple. Epstein's access didn't feel normal. His funding didn't feel normal, and his ability to remain protected for so long didn't feel normal. Rogan described him as something almost artificial, a construct, a man who seemed designed to move through elite spaces, gathering influence, collecting connections. Another guest referenced the idea that Epstein was fishing for intellectuals, drawing respected professors and scientists into his orbit by offering them attention, luxury, and proximity to power. And the narrator notes how clever that strategy would be. Because Epstein surrounded himself with respected names, it created a kind of shield. People assume legitimacy based on the company someone keeps. That social camouflage may have been one of his greatest tools. But the financial question remains the most haunting. Epstein presented himself as a financier, a man with deep investments. But many observers have pointed out that the true origin of his fortune was never fully transparent. Rogan suggested that money can move in ways the public doesn't see, through nonprofits, through hidden channels, through arrangements that are nearly impossible to trace from the outside. Again, none of this is proof of intelligence involvement, but it reflects the broader frustration. People feel like Epstein's story contains missing pages, and when pages are missing, suspicion fills the space. The narrator emphasizes that official investigations have focused primarily on Epstein's trafficking crimes, financial dealings, and network of associates, not on confirming larger geopolitical theories. But the unanswered questions about his wealth continue to linger. Because Epstein didn't just have money, he had access, the kind of access that usually requires powerful backing. Presidents, royalty, billionaires, the highest levels of society. How does someone with such a shadowy background end up photographed beside world leaders? how does someone convicted continue maintaining relationships with influential figures? The narrator explains that these contradictions are what keep the Epstein case from fading into history. It doesn't feel like a closed chapter. It feels like a story where the public was shown the surface, but never the foundation underneath. Rogan himself admitted that digging too deep into it can be toxic, because the more you look, the more you realize how much remains unclear. And that uncertainty is what makes the case feel so dark. Not because every theory is true, but because the lack of transparency allows every theory to survive. And that brings the story to its most explosive point, because despite all the documents, all the flight logs, all the speculation, only one major associate is sitting behind bars: Ghislaine Maxwell, convicted for facilitating trafficking crimes. Which leads right back to the question that started everything. If she helped traffic victims, then where are the clients? Because the final unresolved piece of this case isn't Epstein's network, it's the silence surrounding who benefited from it. And that's where the story reaches its most disturbing conclusion. By the end of the Epstein story, the public is left staring at one undeniable reality. Jeffrey Epstein is gone, but Ghislaine Maxwell remains in prison. She was convicted on federal charges tied to trafficking-related crimes connected to Epstein. A jury found that she helped recruit and groom victims, that she played a central role in maintaining the system Epstein built. And that fact alone makes one question impossible to ignore. If trafficking occurred, if facilitation occurred, then who was it all for? Joe Rogan said it bluntly: how do you put someone in jail for trafficking and never name the clients? To many people, it feels insane, because the existence of trafficking implies demand. It implies buyers. It implies people on the other side of the operation. And yet, beyond Epstein and Maxwell, the list of prosecutions remains limited. The narrator explains that this is where frustration turns into something deeper, not just anger at Epstein, but anger at the silence that followed. Victims have spoken publicly about Maxwell's role. American survivor Annie Farmer, for example, has described Maxwell as aggressive and deeply involved, contradicting Maxwell's attempts to minimize her responsibility. Many survivors say Maxwell was not a passive bystander. She was central. And yet, Maxwell has repeatedly refused to cooperate with investigators. She has invoked her right to silence. When summoned to testify, she declined to answer even basic questions about her relationship with Epstein. Her refusal only fuels suspicion, because people wonder what she knows, who she could name, what information remains buried. The narrator notes that some legal discussions have involved the idea of clemency or negotiation in exchange for testimony, but survivors have expressed outrage at that possibility, arguing that Maxwell has shown no remorse and cannot be treated as a credible source acting in good faith. Still, her silence raises the same haunting implication. Epstein did not act alone. And the public continues to ask why so many details remain sealed. The video highlights how many documents are still redacted, how many files remain hidden, how much evidence authorities reportedly possess that has never been fully released. Some members of Congress have claimed that even after reviewing materials, large portions remain blacked out, and that only intensifies the perception that the full truth is being withheld. Legal experts stress again that being named in records does not equal guilt. Redactions can exist for privacy, defamation concerns, or ongoing investigations. But the Epstein case has reached a point where the public no longer feels satisfied with legal complexity. They want accountability. They want clarity. They want to know how a man like Epstein operated for decades in plain sight, surrounded by elites, without the kind of sweeping consequences people expected. The narrator explains that for many high-profile figures linked socially to Epstein, the consequence has been reputational rather than criminal. Andrew, for example, faced enormous public backlash after allegations surfaced. He denied wrongdoing and was never criminally charged, but the fallout effectively ended his public royal role. Other names have faced scrutiny, criticism, and suspicion, but convictions remain rare. Why does the story feel incomplete? Why does it feel like the public has been given fragments instead of the full picture? Joe Rogan suggested that this is what makes the case so disturbing. It shows that secrets can be kept.
That powerful systems can hold things back for years, and that even in one of the most infamous scandals in history, the final answers may never fully surface. The narrator closes on a thought that lingers long after the video ends. Maybe the most unsettling part of the Epstein case isn't what we know, it's what remains hidden. The names still sealed, the evidence still unanswered. The sense that the real story wasn't just one man, but the world that allowed him to exist. And the question that won't go away is the same one Rogan asked from the beginning. Was this a failure of justice, or was something bigger always operating behind the scenes? Because the most powerful part of this story may still be the part we haven't seen.